Hello and welcome to the Alpine Valley School podcast. I'm your host, Mark Gallivan. This is episode 36 of our show, and we are continuing with our core learning series that we started last episode with learning to read. Today we're going to be discussing how students at our school learn to write. You can find show notes for this episode at alpinevalleySchool.com/podcast/EP36 for episode 36. Before we get into that, I just want to give one housekeeping note that we have an additional way to support Alpine Valley School. With a service called Donation Line, you can donate your used vehicle, car, boat, RV, jet ski, snowmobile, pretty much anything on wheels or that is a mode of conveyance, and send that to our fundraising partner Donation Line, and they will donate the proceeds from the item to our school. We've gotten some great donations in the past from this service, so I wanted to share it with our listeners in case you're looking for another way to help support the school. To find out more, you can go to alpinevalleySchool.com/support, and that shows you all the ways that you can support the work we're doing here. As I said, today on our show, we're talking about learning to write, and I've got two great graduates today that are going to share their stories on how they learned to write at our school, so let's jump right in. Let's meet the graduates you'll be hearing from today.
My name is Vanessa, and I am a podcaster. I'm a writer. I work in communications, basically, and I just graduated with a post-baccalaureate diploma in communication as my second degree, and trying to think, I graduated from AVS in 2004.
My name's Jesse Alford. I'm a software engineer at Pivotal Software. My formal education runs about to that of Huckleberry Finn, which is something that I'm somewhat fond of. I work in a collaborative environment, requires a lot of communication and writing code, but also writing documentation.
How do you use your writing skills in your work life?
People often think of writing as being, especially as a passion, being about fiction. But when I think about writing and where my passion for writing draws me in the work environment is much more around technical documentation, commit messages, documents, or even extemporaneous bits of writing, whether they're on a whiteboard or in a chat room, trying to explain concepts and reach consensus and get ideas across, both with people that you know and work with closely and with people where you have to build up an entire context. So you end up having to think about, okay, what exactly does my audience know? Which pieces of information that I, excited about the topic, may wish to include, do they not actually need in order to think about this the way I'm hoping to help them think about this? So I think this is a specific representation of the stereotypical belief that communication is the most important and complicated and ongoing process in an organization, whether it's a corporation or a nonprofit or whatever. It's just all these little pieces of communication, often written, that tie the organization together and make it exist.
So communication involves writing in many different ways. And I was saying earlier that I'm a podcaster, and you would think, oh, podcasting, it's very audio based. It's something that you might not think would involve a lot of writing, but it really does. Like, you need to be able to plan an episode, which might involve writing notes to yourself. It might involve research, which honestly, you can't do without being able to write. It might involve interviewing somebody and writing down the interview questions after you've researched that person. And it involves writing show notes. Podcasting is super involved with writing. I also do communication for a nonprofit, and I work on the social media. I write blog posts. I write emails. Like, writing touches every single thing that I do pretty much. It's funny because I always said to myself, I want to be a writer when I grow up, like when I was, a teenager or whatever. And I'm not necessarily somebody who's published a book, but I am a writer because I'm writing all the time in so many different ways.
How would you describe your writing life while you were at Alpine Valley School?
I wrote like all the time. I don't think there was a day that I was at AVS where I wasn't working on something, whether it was a poem that I randomly thought of, or a story that I actually wanted to finish, or an assignment for class. Because I think actually the three of us were in sort of a quote unquote English class with one of the staff members, Bruce. And I actually learned in that class basically how to write an essay, which I didn't really know how to do before. And then I went on to, now get 2 university degrees and that kind of thing. Like writing was like my whole life at AVS. I don't even know what more to say. I just was writing all the time. I had said earlier that I kind of had always wanted to be a writer. I've been writing since actually before I could even write. Like, I would draw pictures and tell stories through the pictures, and then I learned how to write, so I started writing instead of drawing pictures. So I think that's just something that's always been a passion of mine and has always been there. But I think honestly that when I was in public school, I felt like my writing passion was squashed a little bit, and I'm not 100% sure why that was. I think maybe because I didn't have the space to really explore and have the freedom to really dig deep within myself and write things that I wanted to write. So at being at AVS, I just had this like tremendous freedom to take that passion and do with it what I wanted to.
So I was driven to write by two things, and one of them I didn't really recognize as writing. Even before I came to AVS, I wrote a fair amount, and it was very weird. It was not what people were asking me to do. I liked technical manuals as a kid, and I'm not talking about technical manuals for printers. I got into those later. I'm talking about the Star Trek technical manual, right? Like a piece of this thick book describing this fake technology and including a lot of diagrams of how phasers and transporters and tractor beams work. I kept some of the ephemera from there, and I can go through it and see, listing outs of how much ammunition and how many days of water the spaceship that I was thinking about carried. And I had stories in mind for this, and I think some of it was inspired by, I was at a Montessori school before AVS, so teachers would, assign a story writing assignment, and I would do the minimum number of words or whatever to actually create the story they were asking for. And then on my free time, I would generate this expansive and detailed accounting of the exact technical capabilities of the starship I had imagined. Once I was at AVS, there was a lot of imaginative play, and some of that came with textual support, right? In addition to having the imaginative play, take something like Dungeons and Dragons, there would be the adventure notes, there would be the plot notes, or the character design notes on ideas for development that I wanted to see maybe players lean into, because I ran a Dungeons and Dragons game for years. As for the writing class, I actually only ever joined 2 formal classes in my time at AVS, Japanese and writing. I joined them in the same year and for the same reason, which was that I had a crush. And so Japanese did not take, the homework was hard, so I stopped. I stayed in the writing class for a very long time because it was very interesting and satisfying. When I decided that I was going to join the writing class, I wrote the first poem that I am aware of having written. Certainly the first poem that I wrote because I wanted to write a poem and not because someone was trying to make me do something. I settled into trying to write fiction like the fiction that I enjoyed, in addition to this weird stuff. The third category of writing, which again was crush-driven, very important for an educational plan for a teenage boy, was chats, online chats. I learned to type, and I was interested in this cool girl who wrote and cared about English. So I learned to be, use correct punctuation, capitalization, and spelling, use good sentence structure, and be clever and enjoyable and communicative in a chat context. And I practiced at it really hard for long hours, probably with instant feedback, right? Because the girl's impressed or she's not. And that was also a big piece of what ended up being my chat client voice, right? Like my written voice, which has continued to be a distinct asset years on.
So how do students at AVS learn to write?
First time I tried my hand at being a JC clerk, I wrote really good notes for JC, and it took far too much time, and it wasn't sustainable, and I burned out. But I wrote those really good notes, and people kept doing that, right? These procedural moments, whether it's the minutes of school meeting or complaints, even when you're writing someone up for the judicial committee, or capturing minutes in a meeting, any sort of, the stuff we were talking about earlier, the procedural communication that makes an organization exist is actually something that students participate in. So I forgot that whole layer of it. And then as you were asking the question of like, oh, how do people learn to write at AVS? There's this whole layer of the experience that generalizes to a bunch of other people and then there's people who, much like learning to read by playing video games, end up learning to write in order to do fan fiction or tell each other theories about video games. There's participation in internet discussions and forums. There are group chats. That's more and more a thing. So it's just really woven through the AVS experience. And I was going to say, if you can't write, you can't participate, but it doesn't really work that way. No one can't write. They learn to write so that they can participate.
I remember the younger kids sometimes coming up to me and saying, I want to write up so-and-so, take them to JC, but I can't write. Can you help me? So I would help them. I wasn't going to sit there and be like, okay, I'm going to teach you how to write now. But I would write it for them, and I'd be like, okay, tell me what you want me to say and I'll put it down. And I also remember as those kids grew up, realizing that they wanted to have that agency to write somebody up. So they had to figure out how to do it. And I remember one of the younger girls coming up to me and being like, can you help me write up this person? I want to do it myself, but can you tell me if I'm doing it right? And this memory just came back to me. And I remember feeling like, oh, yes, of course. Like I felt really honored. I was at AVS from 2000 to 2004. Writing was definitely a huge thing, but it's really a huge thing now. Like Jesse was saying, group texts, group chats, texting each other on phones. Like we need to be able to write in this, day and age, so to speak. And I imagine that those kinds of technologies have really even become more used at AVS. Like I remember being at AVS and we were like, ooh, we have cable internet, and now it's like everybody's got a phone, I'm assuming, and things have really changed. So I just think that it's just hard to avoid having to write, and I would be very surprised if there was ever a kid who came out of AVS not being able to write.
That does it for episode 36 of our show. You can find show notes for this episode at alpinevalley.com/podcast/EP36 for episode 36. As always, thanks for listening. I'm Mark Gallivan. This is the Alpine Valley School podcast, and we'll be back again soon with more stories of real learning for real life.